Okay, continuing with shiurim on the dinim of bar mitzvah, where we stopped the third shiur on bar mitzvah. And like I said a few times, bar mitzvah is one of the most common topics that come today on him, and also one of the most misunderstood topics. People think that they have more rights than they actually do. Today we're going to go through Sa'ifim Yud Aleph, Yud Gimel, Yud Daled. Starting from about Tezvav, Tezayin, you'll start seeing all the exceptions to the rules of Bar Mitzvah until pretty much the end of the Siman. So all the times that there is, most of the times there's no Bar Mitzvah. Up until here we saw most of the times that there is Bar Mitzvah. Sif Yud Aleph discusses when you have 4 Matzronim and 1 Sada is going up for sale. So essentially when you have more than 1 Matzron, who is the one that gets it from the lekeach? The lashon of the mechaber is that if all 4 came bo ke'echad, then you split it between all 4, and everybody points out you split it. Each one gets a triangle that's close to him. The reason why a person gets a triangle and not each one gets a square, even though according to Svara, what are you going to do with a triangle? You can't drive a tractor into a triangle, the corner of the triangle, is because otherwise you're going to have a problem of hezekriya, something which you want to avoid. If each one gets a quarter, then each person is going to have part of his quarter visible to somebody, to his existing property is going to have part that is visible from somebody else's property, in which case it will become hezekriya to what he already has. Masha'inkin, in this extension, the way this is done, your whole property is being, your whole old property line is being protected from the shaila of hezekriya. What happens if one of the matzronim goes to the lekeach and pays him and takes the field? So he is zoich in it. He doesn't have to then go and split it with the rest of the matzronim. That is how the mechaber paskins. The same thing if one of the matzronim goes and he's the one who purchases it first from the seller. Same thing. The Ramah says l'chatchila you have to sell to all the matzronim equally, and yesh cholkim. Pretty cryptic. What's the yesh cholkim? And what's the svara over here? What's going on? Why is it that you have such a din? First of all, that somebody could jump and take it first. Why is it that you split it between? What does l'chatchila mean? When does l'chatchila? What is it b'diavad over here? What's bo ke'echad? What difference does it make? And this is very common if you think about city blocks where you could have a house in the middle of the block which has 2 attached matzronim. Sometimes you have 3 because you have the house behind it. If there's no driveway, if there's no alleyway between the 2, so then a standard house here on this side of Union Street, the one that's closer to Kailo, every house has at least 3 matzronim. You have on the right, you have on the left, and you have in the back. Behind it, facing Eastern Parkway. On the Eastern Parkway side, because there's no alleyway on the block on this block that we're on. There's an alleyway on the next block, but not on this one. So you have 3 matzronim. So putting aside the question of how matzronim in houses, shaila is who gets it? The guy on the right, the guy on the left, the guy behind. How do you split it 3 ways? How would it work in such a scenario? And what happens if one gets it first? So the Smeh first of all explains what is the definition, why is it that all 4 get it, or 3 get it, or whatever, 5 get it, whatever the number is because it depends on whether bo ke'echad or not. It means if all 4 showed up at one time doesn't mean they all walked into Bezin together, just the bo ke'echad means they all came in one right away, pretty much the same day, the same time. So then, even if the seller wants to sell it to only one of them, he likes one neighbor from before, he only wants to sell it to one of them, then the lekeach has the new lekeach, who is also a matzah, and has to then go ahead and split it with everybody else. Why is that? It's based on what? It's based on the Ramah writes in Seif Vav that a matzah is koine bal korach shel lekeach. If a matzah has a right to a property, he's koine even against the will of the lekeach. So over here, the lekeach is also a matzah, and if the matzah had a inherent right to this property, he's also koine this property. Bal korach shel matzah. They came all, because they all came together, they all enforced their rights at the same time, so nobody is able to go and take it first. However, if they didn't come all together, then the first matzah came. And the Bach actually explains that even though we say that the matzah, that the lekeach is be'etzem shliach of all the matzronim, in this scenario we don't say that he came within shlichus. This matzron / lekeach does not become the shliach of the other matzronim, and therefore, if he's koidem, he gets it. The Smek continues, therefore, what does the Ramah say? L'chatchila yimker l'kulam, sell to everybody at the same time. It obviously means that it's before one of the matzronim jumped and bought it. It means if the seller wants to sell it, l'chatchila, he should approach all four. And who's the Yeshayim? Yesh Chalkim. The Yesh Chalkim that the Ramah brings is that's not so. That if that this whole din of that you have to l'chatchila sell it to all four does only apply to the lekeach. The lekeach who now has it, essentially his holding of it is b'shlichus of the. This is a data that Beis Yosef brings. He's holding it for all the matzranim. So therefore, l'chatchila, he should offer it to all four. But if it's the moicher who wants to sell it, the moicher doesn't have to go through the headache of selling one property to four people. The moicher, for mitzad his vasisa yosher v'atayv, it's enough if he sells it to one matzah. That's the yesh chelkim. And bichlal, the Bach says, that daya is not the Bach. The daya that the Beis Yosef brings, that becomes the Yesh Chalkim. And the Beis Yosef explains very simply because the lekeach, because the din of Asisa Vayosher Atev doesn't even really apply to the seller, only applies to the lekeach. So the seller, by him selling it to one person, who is a matzren, even if he didn't have to do Asisa Vayosher Atev, he's doing it regardless. But to go through the headache of four, he doesn't have to. The Beis Yosef himself disagrees with that. That's why the Beis Yosef doesn't even bother to mention the day of Yesh Chalkim in the Shulchan Aruch. The Ramah is the one who says Yesh Chalkim as an additional day. No, same day, around the same time. Not. The day of Metzah you see later in the Siman applies. It only lasts for 2-3 days, a day or two.
So you're saying Kol Gachal means before day 2, but the first day.
The first day, they all came together. It means that no, not all of them. It means Bo Ke'echad. No, it could be, what do you mean? Today we say that Bar Metzah applies longer, to a certain degree. Because today nobody buys houses with cash. You have to get a wire from the bank. You have to get even if you don't have mortgages or something else, but let's say both of them have money in the bank. So, and you went and you did it on the Motzei Shabbos. So the person bought it in the Motzei Shabbos. The wire is not going to be able to kick in until Monday morning because the banks don't work on those days. And if it's like this week, the Memorial Day was on Monday, so the banks are not working until Tuesday. So what, you're going to say that the matzron lost out because he wasn't able to get a wire in until Tuesday morning? That's something which is not in his control. Obviously the matzronis extends more than the 2 days. Or he found out on Friday afternoon. It was bought Friday morning. He found out Friday afternoon. He sends a message that he wants to buy it. We're going to start kicking in the 2 days, a day or two. And then what? He couldn't get the wire in. What am I supposed to do? The banks were closed. I couldn't rob the bank. I didn't have a gun. What am I supposed to do now? Couldn't break a lock. I lost. You don't lose from it. But here we're talking about Bokach. They all came in one sitting, in one shot. That's how the Smek explains it. The Taz explains it differently. What does the Ramah, when the Ramah says that l'chatchila yimker l'kulam, this l'chatchila is talking about when Bokach. That's the day of the Ramah. if they all came together, then lechatchila you should sell to all four. The moicher, not the lekeach. The moicher should sell to all four if they bo ke'echad. Then the yesh chalkim say no. Even if all four bo ke'echad to the moicher has no obligation to sell it to all four. Even if bo ke'echad, he doesn't have to offer it. It's not talking about offering. He doesn't have to chase anybody. He's talking about if bo ke'echad, then that's what he has to. Then that's what he has to do. And that's why the way the Taz explains it, the moicher can sell to whoever he wants. And however, if they didn't come all ke'echad, then the moicher doesn't have to even bother approaching all the four and trying to sell to them. He can sell it to whoever he wants. Yeah. Then in such a case, that if it's the question is what's the lechatchila? According to the Taz, the lekeach doesn't have to. Only 404 came at the same time. Yeah. So it seems like. And it's what's the mashmos of the Ramah according to the Taz is that even if that being that the Ramah says lechatchila, that means that even if all four ke'echad, and he went ahead and sold it to only one of them, the other ones can't be mesalik him. And the only machlekes is lechatchila, what should he do? And this is not like the smeh. And the Chalas Lechem paskins like the smeh, and the Sivis paskins like the smeh. That when they all come together, they are the one that's koine is koine bal karchoi of the one. The one that's koine is koine for all four, and they receive it bal karchoi. Now, when you look at the shach, from the shach it's also mashma lechatchila. What does lechatchila mean? That if they were not bo ke'echad, even lechatchila you could sell to one of them. Yeah, the Mechaber concludes, if part of the Matzronim are in a different country, then those that are here could be mesalik the lekeach, and the rest who are not in the country lost out. Then the Sivis comes and asks a question and says, I don't understand what the Mechaber is saying. Greise Chiddush, if they're out of town, they lose out when they're a Matzrin. Even if the Matzrin is one Matzrin, and he's out of town, and the lekeach comes and buys it, and the Matzrin comes back later after the time frame in Sif Lamed Vav, the Mechaber clearly paskins that he lost out. So you want to tell me if by a lekeach the Matzrin loses out, alachas kama v'kama by a Matzrin to a Matzrin that he loses out. So what's the big chiddush? The Sivis doesn't answer the question. However, if you look in Choshen Ve'ephod, which is a book that he says like a book in Hilchos Matzranos, in Sifkot and Yud Aleph, he explains that what's the chiddush over here? The chiddush is that if the lekeach comes and says, there's 4 Matzronim, right? Only 2 are in town. The one on the east and the one on the north. I'll cut my field in half along diagonal, in a diagonal line. I'll give half of my field to those 2 Matzronim, and I'll keep the other half for myself. On that, the Mechaber says no. That doesn't work. That's the one the Mechaber is trying to teach over here. That the lekeach has no rights. Matzrin versus Matzrin has a right. But in this case, the lekeach would not have a right. Even though Sif Lamed Vav would have a right. Over here, he wouldn't have a right. Over here, the Matzrin, one Matzrin versus another Matzrin, if he's out of town, he has a right. But not Stam, the lekeach could hold it. In Oitzer HaMishpat, he explains also differently what the Chiddush is. In one of the footnotes in Oitzer HaMishpat, he says that in Sif Lamed Vav, what are we talking about? That the seller is the one that wants to sell over there. And therefore, if you're going to wait until the Matzrin comes back, there's going to be a hefsed that the moicher has to wait. Therefore, we say over there that the lekeach is koidem if the Matzrin is out of town. But over here, that the seller doesn't mind waiting. Or if it went to the lekeach already, so the seller is out of the picture, the Matzronim, the chiddush is that even though, technically speaking, you could say, wait for the person to come back. We don't say that you wait for the person to come back. Now, let's continue a few more details about this sif. Yeah, this sif we're talking about, you have 4 matzranim, 5 matzranim, 10 matzranim, less than 4. What happens if you have 1 matzran? You have 3 matzranim. 1 matzran has north and east. Another matzran has west, another matzran has south. Does the one who has 2 meitzarim have more right than the other 2? Because are you going to say now that because he has 2 sides, he's a stronger matzran than the other matzranim? So the chalas lechem brings an interesting tshuva from the Ranach, Maimon Mokim, that yeah, he's koydem. He's first. He has 2.
It's more or he's koydem?
Huh? He's koydem. He could get it. No, he has more rights. He could buy the whole thing. And the chalas lechem says on it, I don't understand where this comes from. Nobody mentions this tshuva. It contradicts what the Shulchan Aruch himself says in this sif, because the Shulchan Aruch says if you have a bunch of matzranim, and even if one matzran has a tiny sliver and is touching the field, he's also part of the package. So there's no, the Mechaber clearly disqualifies this svara that a person who has more land touching the disputed field has more rights to it. Another interesting nakuda. If the matzran is not in town, but his wife is in town, we say ishtei kegufay. Does he lose out or he doesn't lose out? Because ishtei kegufay. So the chalas, the erech lechem in Ois Tes brings a deya that she cannot be masalik the lekeach on behalf of her husband. Even though ishtei kegufay, she doesn't have that right, and since the husband's out of town, he lost out. And the svara for it is not explained in the erech lechem, but there is a not erech lechem, it's erech hashulchan. Sorry, erech hashulchan. The svara is not explained over there, but when you're going to get to Sif Yudal, you're going to understand the svara behind it, which we're going to get to soon. What, the husband or Bichlal?
The husband being in town.
I said, we're going to get Sif Yudal. The husband, the wife doesn't have money of her own.
Not about the general, why you need the Baal, not Baal, in general, why you need the
Because the Yoshev HaToiv is only for the time that you're there, you walked out, you lost out. That's it. That's the rule. Yoshev HaToiv is not a non-expiring thing. It's a chiddush that we say it. So the chiddush is limited to...
The word is because you're not sure if the guy is going to want it.
Right, you have a suffix.
That's the word. So
That's
now,
essentially...
if someone calls up the guy on the other side of the room and says, do you want it? He says, yeah.
He could wire the money from there, then it's fine. If he finds out and he could send a message right away. Yeah, that counts. Today, this whole going out of town thing would not be relevant because the person could send a message that he wants it and send a wire that day.
Unless he's fighting in the war.
He's fighting in the war, that's out of town. Yeah. Let's move on to Sif Yud Gimel. Yeah, there is a... Let's skip Sif Yud Beis. Look, Lekeach bought one field that belonged to 2 people. The Matzrin comes and says, I want to throw you out from a half of the field. Why? Because only half is touching mine. And you bought from 2 people. So essentially, even though this field wasn't split up yet, I'm buying from you the part which belonged to Shutaf A, and that is touching my field. He doesn't have, the Matzrin doesn't have the right to do it, rather he must take both sections together, the full field in one shot. That's what the Mechaber says. The Rama adds, what happens if one person buys from 2 people 2 fields, 2 fields, then the Matzrin could tell him, you bought 2 fields, get out of one. And now comes an argument. What are we talking about over here? Which 2 fields are we talking about? The Smer right away says, We're only talking about over here that there's 2 fields were sold. The smeh is in the suffix, but the smeh svara seems like that if, what are we talking about over here? I'm a matzrin on one side. Next to me is 2 fields, which were owned by 2 different people, and came Reuven and bought the 2 fields from these 2 people because he wanted to do something over there, wanted to build a nice apartment building on these 2 fields together because they're long and narrow. Together they works for him. Or whatever, it doesn't make a difference, want to plant more. And so then he could say, because they bought from 2 people, then the matzrin could throw them out all of one of them. But if the lekeach bought 2 joined fields from one seller, then he can't throw him out. Even not only he can't throw him out from one field, he can't even throw him out from both fields together. Why is that? Because in Seif Lamed Vav it says, if somebody sells all his fields, if someone sells all his fields to somebody, the matzrin cannot remove this person even from all the fields together. And the smeh says, and even though you could farent for it over there, we're talking about moicher kol sadoisav or something which is not so common. And therefore the chachamim were not masakin in such a thing, because a person wants to sell everything because he's under financial pressure, and he's going to start splitting it up, he's not going to get what he needs, so he sells the whole portfolio in one shot. That's not such a common thing to sell, and therefore we don't say bar metzra. But over here, for somebody to sell 2 fields together is something which is relatively common. Still in all, the smeh says, no. The mechaber doesn't say that the reason is because kol sadoisav versus less than that. The mechaber says the reason why you can't throw him out from kol sadoisav is because knam kulam ke'echad. The lekeach acquired all of them together, and therefore you cannot get rid of him. So if the svara is because he acquired all of them together, so when you acquired 2, you also acquired those 2 together, and therefore the same svara would apply, that you can't get rid of him even from both. And the smeh remains in tzarich. Chiyun is not machriya. The shach, total opposite way. Has nothing to do with bokeh, nothing to do with it's 1 seller or 2 sellers. It has to do if it's 2 fields or 1 field. Therefore, if you buy 2 fields from 1 person, if you buy from 2 people, you could get rid of him from one of the fields. And what says that Amos says in Sif Lamed Vav, and the Mechaber says in Sif Lamed Vav, is only Machar Kol Sadoisav, not if he sold Machar Kol Nechasav, he sold all his property, not if he sold only 2. Which would make an interesting situation. What happens if a person Taka only owns 2, and that's his whole portfolio, and that's Kol Nechasav. So over there, it would seem there is no real machlokes between the shach and the smeh, and how to understand this if Lamed Vav, which you're going to get to, in a week or 2. The Nesivis paskins like the shach, even though usually paskins like the smeh most of the time. Over here, paskins like the shach. The Ktsas brings the smeh. And the Ktsas goes into a discussion about it. And the Ktsas brings the smeh, and he says, and he explains what's Seif Lamed Vav. He wants to farent for the kasha of the smeh, because the smeh stayed in tzarich chiyun from Seif Lamed Vav. So he says, don't get too hung up on Seif Lamed Vav. Seif Lamed Vav is talking about 2 fields, and only one of them is next to the matzah. Therefore, it's 2 or more fields. Therefore, since the lekeach bought a package of fields that only one of them is connected to the matzah, only one of them is touching to the matzah, so over there we say, since he was koine ke'echad, one that does not touching the matzah, and one that is touching the matzah, in such a scenario, you can't throw him out even from the one that's close to the matzah. But over here, what are we talking about? That both fields are touching the matzrin, are near the matzrin, touching each other. And therefore, because over there, Machar Kol Nechasav could be sold one house on President Street and one house on Montgomery Street. One property and one property. Over here we're talking about that both are attached and they are one connected to the other, one connected to the Matzrin. And therefore, even if he buys from one, he could throw him out from both fields together. Even if he bought from one person. Now, let's go move, that's the Shach. We're going to soon get to the סימן, the Shach. I just want to mention one more point for the Nesivis. The Nesivis in Biurim Sifkat and Gimel discusses that if one person, the Moicher, had two fields, and he sold only one to the Lekeach, which one did he choose to sell to the Lekeach? The one that's touching the Matzah. And the Moicher kept the other one on the other side. Then passes some time, whatever, a day later, the Moicher, 2 days later, the Moicher comes and sells to the Lekeach the next field. The one that's not touching the Matzah. The next house. So then he says the Matzah could only throw him out from the first one, the one that's touching, not the second one, because they were not sold together. Why? Because when he gets to the next one, at that stage, the Lekeach was already a Matzrin. Because the Lekeach, you have the Matzrin house number 1. Lekeach bought house number 2. The next day, Lekeach bought house number 3. Now he comes, the Matzrin comes and says, I want house 2 and 3. The Lekeach says, Mela house 2 that I bought, that was wrong. I bought it. But once I bought house number 3, I bought it while I owned house number 2. Therefore, I am a Matzrin to house number 3, just like you're a Matzrin to house number 2. And therefore, I had a right to buy it, and you have no right to take me out. I'm a Matzrin, which was Kodim. And therefore, you're not going to be able to get me out. Now that you took me out of house number 2, technically I'm Ois Matzrin. Doesn't make a difference. When I bought it, I didn't do anything wrong. The only way you could throw them out of both houses, house 2 and 3, is if house 2 and 3 were sold together. Now, what happens? Now we have to, this is something which I did not see in the Nesivis. What happens if the Tziur is verkehrt? What happens if he sold, this Moicher sold house number 3 first to the Lekeach? He didn't sell house number 2. And then 2 months later, he goes and he sells house number 2 to the Lekeach. So the Lekeach has been a Matzrin for a while now. And he didn't do anything wrong by buying it, because the original Matzrin had no rights to house number 3, only to house number 2 if it gets sold. Do we say over here that he is a Matzrin, or we say that he is not? And it's pretty clear that he has a right to keep that house. He's not no longer considered a somebody who has any rights to that one. If there's Arama, you could go argue with Arama, which we dealt with in the previous one. Bring Rayas, whatever it is. By the way, this Nesivis that I mentioned to you, if you look at Avnei Choshen, I'm not going to get into it now, the Avnei Choshen puts forth a bunch of questions in the Nesivis, says the Nesivis makes absolutely no sense, but loy mila'ani libi lachlei kal Nesivis, and therefore the question is a question, that's it. We're just going to leave it at a question. Let's go back to the Shach and the סימן. Actually, before we go to the Shach and the סימן, I want to point out one nekuda. There is a interesting kesef hakachim where, actually we'll get to kesef hakachim later. Okay, Shoshanas Yaakov, let's go to the Shach and the סימן. Shoshanas Yaakov in Sifkat and Yud goes to a discussion about the סימן and the Shach. What do they exactly refer to? Yeah, what do we know? According to the Shach, let's recap. According to the Shach, even if one person buys 2 fields from one person, still the Matzah can be Masalikim only from one. And according to the Smeh, there's no real achra. It seems like the Smeh holds that you cannot take him out of that, even of both. Yeah, but the Smeh remains in tzarechiyun. Comes to Shoshana Yaakov and says, I don't understand. Look in the Beis Yosef later on in the Siman. Beis Yosef al-Tur, Mechudesh Lamed, which is, in these prints, it's parallel to Sif Samach Beis. What's the story over there? There was a person who had a house, the first floor, and the second floor there was a store. One Yid rented the house, one Yid rented the store. Now comes the renter of the store, and he wants to buy both. And the renter of the house also wants to buy both. And the renter of the house says, I live here, I am a matzon to the store. And the moicher was not ready to sell it in two pieces. He had a price for the whole property, and he said, I'm selling it as one. That's it. I'm not dealing with one and then the other in two different transactions. One transaction, you guys figure it out. They went to the Beis Yosef for a psak. This is the Beis Yosef who writes it in the Beis Yosef says that the renter of the house has no right to claim matzronos on the store more than the renter of the store who claim matzronos in his own store. Why? Because the soicher of the store is a matzron by him being in the store. So he becomes a matzron to his own store. And he gives a whole list of reasons, the Beis Yosef, and the Beis Yosef concludes the last one that, in a very important point which the Beis Yosef throws at the end, was part of the story. He says another reason why we're here, I'm not going to apply bar mitzvah, is because the renter of the store wants to expand the store and he's being mispanus from it. The renter of the house wants to buy both, so he, not for his own use, so then he could then go and rent the store out. Not because he wants to rent it to somebody else. He'll get a much higher rent afterwards. And therefore he says the renter of the store is zoiche in it, and we'll soon see what it means, what exactly is zoiche in. No, we'll soon see. Now if he gets both, it's not exactly clear what the Beis Yosef says. That's the whole discussion. Now, if he says, and even if a random lekeach would have then come and bought the store, just the store, and be mispanus from it, the renter of the house would not be able to say, I am, by me renting the house, I'm a bar mitzvah to the store, and I want to be the one to throw you out of the store and buy it for myself. And they conclude, the Beis Yosef concludes, in this din, each one is a matzrin for himself. The renter of the house is a matzrin of the house. The renter of the store is a matzrin on the store. And neither of them can remove the other one from theirs, even if the other one is the one that went ahead and bought it. And if they can't come to an agreement between them who should be the one to buy it, they buy it together. And then you make a shuma, you make a calculation how much it's worth, each part, and each one will pay what his part is worth. And the Darkei Moshe puts a comment on this story of the Beis Yosef. Darkei Moshe is caught in your test. Tzarechiyun. Why tzarechiyun? Because someone sells all his property to one person. There is no din of the bar mitzvah, and the Beis Yosef himself paskins like this. So therefore, the owner over here is actually zich to sell the whole property to one, the store and the house. And therefore, if he sold it to the store owner, how could the Beis Yosef say that the whole discussion of matzronos over here, a whole long discussion of matzronos doesn't begin, that's the kasha of the Darkei Moshe.
He didn't sell it anymore.
He wants to sell it. Or he sold it to one, he says, what does the Beis Yosef say that one, each one's a matzon? He says, the seller clearly says, I'm selling it to one person. So there's no matzronos over here. And even if you want to say that it's there is matzronos over here, each one is a matzron. Each one is a matzron to his own and a matzron to his neighbor. So if you have two matzronim and one is kodim v'zoicher, like we learned in the previous sif, kodim v'zoicher, so he gets it. So I don't understand what the question is. So Shoshanas Yaakov says, the fact that the Darkei Moshe asked such a question on a property which had a store and a house, and compared it to Moicher Kol Nechasav, means that the Ramah holds that if you sell two fields, even if they're attached, one person sells two units, two things together, it's the category of Moicher Kol Nechasav. And there's no din of the B'Metzra. So therefore, if one person sells two fields, for sure he can't be Masalikim from either of them. For sure not like the Shach. And only like the Havamin of the Smeh. And he says, and even though the Ktsas gives a great explanation that we're talking about, that the Moicher Kol Sadoisav is when one field is here, one field is there, one field is there. But not they're all attached and touching the matzah. And over here talking about touching the matzah. And he says, no, the Shach and the Smed don't hold like the Ktsas. And Bechlal, he says, he puts a bunch of questions on the Ktsas. So therefore he says, according to the Darkei Moshe, it's a problem side to the Smed and side to the Shach. No, in the Maskana. Because the Havamin, he says, you can't throw them out from both. So therefore the Shoshanas Yaakov explains, and he's actually machriyav in this scenario, that if the matzrin is matzrin to both fields, not that both fields are attached. If the matzrin is now matzrin to both fields, that means you have one person has a field the shape of an L, that's the matzrin, or he has two fields, one field on the east, one field on the west, and by that he became a matzrin to both fields that are in the middle that are being sold, then even according to the Shach that holds that you could throw him out of one field, it's only when he's a matzrin only to one field. So he's mechadash like this. He says, throwing somebody out of one field is only when he's a matzrin only to one field. But if he's a matzrin to both, he can't throw him out from one. He can't say, I'm cherry picking which matzronos I want to enforce. Why? Because the lekeach could tell him, if you're a matzrin and you're a matzrin to both, take both.
Didn't he say that either way there's no matzronos?
What? He says, that's how I understand that. That's where he says, so to be able to explain what the situation over here of Moicher Shtei Sodas, he says you have to say that it's nothing to do with Moicher Kol Sadoisav over here. Nothing to do with selling two or selling one, Kainaka Echad. It's something totally different. It boils down to the question of whether there is a Matzronas claim to both or not. If you have a Matzronas claim only to one, and not to both, then you could take only one. If you have a Matzronas claim to both, you cannot take one and leave the other one hanging. He says the Shach will be moida in such a case that he can't only take one.
I don't understand. Oh, you're saying, but the Allah either way not like the Shach, because the Allah either way not like the Shach.
Why not?
The Shach, we're agreeing such a case.
Why is not the Allah not like the Shach?
Because he just proved that according to the second.
He asked the question. He didn't prove for sure. And he says, so therefore he says, and when the Ramah says that you could force him to take only one, it's obviously when he's a matzron only to one of them. And he continues, he concludes, he says that's the only way to understand this din. And the Shoshanas Yaakov concludes and says, okay, let's go back to the story of the Beis Yosef for a minute, he says. He says, what comes out from the story of the Beis Yosef? An interesting thing. That if the Soicher or the Soichrim in the story of the Beis Yosef, or the Lekeach went and bought the part of the Matzronos, that means the disputed part, together with another field that's not adjacent to it, that's not connected to it. According to the Shach, you could get rid of him, the Matzron could get rid of him from one. But then you don't know how much each one's worth. So you use what the Beis Yosef shita, that you do a shuma, how much each part is worth, because the seller sold it all as a package. The peasant has to make a shuma, how much is this part worth versus the selling price. And the same thing he says, if there's a chashash of arama, you also do a shuma. Before I'm going to go to,
in such a case, I think everyone would agree. If you sold a field here and a field in a different...
Right, so he says, that's what he says, b'derech hagav, he says, since I just brought the story of the Beis Yosef, I want to teach you a din that comes out of it. Now,
in a case where you sold a field in this city, a field in this city, the Kula Almi, there's no din Matzah.
not different city, we're talking about in the same city, we're talking about, but how do you calculate when a thing is sold together? How do you calculate it? Saying a general rule. Before I'm going to go to Erech Shai, I just want to point out the Kesef HaKochim that I'm going to mention before. Kesef HaKochim over here says that, let's say somebody bought two fields together for a specific price, and the Matzah wants to throw them out of one of them, according to the Shittas HaShach, that he could throw them out of one. And the Lekeach says, for me, the field that's touching yours is much more valuable than the other one. I wouldn't have bought just the other one. I paid $2 million for two fields, but not because each field is worth $1 million. One field that you're matzah into is worth for me 1.8. Why? It's a corner lot, let's say. The one next to it, I would not pay $200,000 for it because I can't do anything with it. It's narrow and long. I bought the two together so I could build the building. The marshal. So he says, in such a case, the bezin has to do a shuma according to das abriyos. Interesting case of a kachim. He stays in Tzarech Chiyun, but he says according to das abriyos, calculate the value of what this field is worth, because this guy could be exaggerating. He says it's 1.8 versus 200. Maybe it's 1.3 versus 700, 1.5 versus 500. There is a value to it. You have to see what it is. Let's go back. Now, the Erech Shai also goes into this whole shach smeh issue, and also asks a question on the shach and the smeh, and also from the Beis Yosef, but not from the Beis Yosef over here, but the Beis Yosef in the tshuva. In Afkas Roichel Siman Kuf Yutes. Also about the store, a house in the store. Also about a soichrim. But over there it's talking about a goy. Goy was the owner. The goy had a property, who had a house on top of the store. And he rented the store out to a yid. And then the guy goes and sells the house where he lives, plus the store that he rents to a yid, to another yid. Together.
He's renting it to yid?
No, he's living downstairs and he's renting the upstairs to a yid, the store. And then he goes and he finds a different yid, some real estate guy who buys both together. And now the Beis Yosef of their paskins, being that the guy wanted to sell both of them together, and the soicher in that scenario only wanted to buy the store, he didn't need the house. So it becomes a raw, something bad for the moicher, and there's no din of the bar metzra. Why? Because maybe the seller is not going to be able to find one person who will only buy the house. Huh?
We don't care about that.
I know, we'll get to that in a second. Maybe one person can buy it at all. And even if he might find somebody to buy it different separately, the house and the store, this house, he might not pay as much for the house. He would not make as much from selling the house separately and the store separately as if he would make from selling both together. So it's still a rah for the moicher. And even if he would find, but it will take him some time, it's still considered a rah to the moicher. And therefore he paskins that even if you would say that the soicher has a din matzah, which bechlal by soicher if he's a matzah or not is a shayla. Over here, there will be no din of the bar metzra, and he says, befrat, we're talking about a guy, so b'chal the bar metzra, but he's discussing it in theory. Lu yitzur, this would be a yid. And therefore, this story also proves one, only the havamin of the smeh. That he could only, if he doesn't want to take both, he can't be mesalikim even from one, and not like the shach. The Erech Shai. So this is a proof to the havamin of the smeh and not to the shach, and therefore he doesn't understand what the question of the smeh is. Now he says, you have the story of the Beis Yosef. We're talking about the yid that rented the bottom and the upstairs and the downstairs are two different people. He says The Beis Yosef says you both buy it together and you do a shumah how much each one is worth. He says obviously, the Erech Shai says obviously we're talking about before one of them purchased it, even though the Beis Yosef doesn't say it clearly. He says it's talking about obviously before one of them purchased it. But if one of them jumped and purchased it first, he was zoiche in the whole thing. Why? Because he says, the proof for that, for my svara, he says, is from the Avkas Reichel. By the Avkas Reichel, the person was a matzrin only to one of the things. Why? He was a soicher. He was a matzrin only to where he is. And therefore, there's a discussion if the matzrin has a right to buy both or doesn't have a right to buy both. But in the story of the Beis Yosef, you have two matzronim, so there's no svara to say that if one matzron jumps ahead and takes it first, he has to give to the other person. Why? Because what's the logic that if you have two matzronim and you sell to one, you don't have to give to the other. You don't have to give to the other one, because if the lekeach who's a matzron would know that he's going to have to give up half of it to somebody else, he would not buy it from the seller. The seller is going to end up stuck, because who's he going to sell it to? Sells it to lekeach. Lekeach is not going to want to buy it because he has to deal with the matzronim. Sells it to one of the two. Each one's going to have to deal with it. If the yid sells it to a goy, and there's Yiddish and Matzranim over there, you end up in a whole different story that is much later in Shulchan Aruch, not in this Siman and not in this Chelik in Shulchan Aruch, that if you buy that's in the category of doing a gram hezek to the people over there. When you sell a Jewish property to a guy in the place of Jews. Yeah, but it's not relevant to this case. So therefore, this whole din of the Beis Yosef to make a shuma, in general, only applies when it's before it was sold from the meicher to one of them. Once it was sold to one of them, it's no longer applicable, the whole shuma. The Mechaber concludes, if one sells karka to two people, the seller went and sold one property to two people, the matzrin could throw both of them out, or he could throw one out and keep the other one out. And the Shach says, obviously, if two people sold two fields, each one sold one field to two people, so you have, and the matzrin is matzrin to both houses, he'll negotiate with one, throw that one out, negotiate with the other one, throw that one out. The Avnei Choshen says, not so fast. If two people, one person sold his field to two people, the Mechaber says the matzrin could throw out one or both. He says, what happens if one of the two people who bought it says, I don't want to be a shutuf with the matzrin. The matzrin wants to buy only half, wants to buy Reuven's chelik, I'm Shimon, I don't want to deal with the matzrin, I don't want to be a shutuf with the matzrin. The matzrin has to buy both. Matzrin can't say, I'm forcing you Reuven, to sell your part to me because you're half that's closer to me, but I'm not going to buy it because Shimon says, no, it doesn't work like that. We bought it together, as two. I'm only willing to be a shutaf with Reuven. You can't take Reuven out and force me to remain your shutaf. And even if there's din chalukah, the Avnei Choshen says, the lekeach could still say, I didn't buy it for chalukah. I bought it because, as we discussed before Pesach, the whole din could be, I bought it with the intention of remaining partners with him. And I don't want to be chaylik. So therefore, the matzah has to buy both. That's what he says. It's not so fast that he could just get rid of one, not the other one. And he concludes over there, what happens now, let's take a different scenario. If the moicher sells half of his field to one person, and the matzrin comes and says, I want to get rid of that half that you sold, that shutaf that you bought. The matzrin can't be mesalik that shutaf, that new shutaf, if the moicher is not interested in the matzrin being his partner, the same as before. But if if one of the shutfim doesn't say anything, doesn't say, I don't want to be a partner with you, I don't want to do chaluk and all that, then obviously he could be mesalik wherever he wants, like Shulchan Aruch says. The Choshen Ve'efoid point Ois Yudalet points out that if the matzrin only gets rid of one of them, why? Because he likes the other lekeach. He says the reason I'm throwing out Reuven and not Shimon is because I like Shimon. Then he says that's a valid reason to say that. But if he says I'm only throwing out Reuven because I can only afford half the field, there's no din of Metzra. If it comes to financial considerations, no din of Metzra. And from that we roll into Sif Yudalid, which is also about financial considerations. Sif Yudalid is a short one. Well, you know what everybody knows Nichsim Milug is. A woman owns property. The property she brings into the marriage. The husband has a right to the paytas of the property. He's like a lekeach for the paytas of the property, like a lekeach or a yerish, a discussion of what it is, potential yerish, lekeach for the property. And the land remains, essentially the land is her land. Because if the husband dies before the wife, his kids are not yerish that land. But as long as the land is in place, he has a right to the paytas. Now what happens is a nichsim milug. Yeah, she brought it into the marriage. Nichsim milug is house number 1. House number 2 goes on sale. The husband goes, and he says, I'm throwing out the lekech from house number 2. That works, because he's be'etzem, he is, not house, field number 2. He's be'etzem now, he holds on to field number 1. And even if the wife who is the landowner of field number 1 says, I don't care. I'm the landowner. I'm the real landowner over here is me. I don't care. And she makes a kinyan with the lekeach. I'm waiving to you the right. You could keep land number 2. The husband could then come afterwards and throw the lekeach out. And what happens if the other way around? If she goes and she throws out the lekeach, and she keeps and then she takes the field. She takes field number 2. The husband comes and says, what do you do? I had that $1 million in the bank because I was putting it into an investment. You know, there's a new stock coming out next week. I want to put it into there. You took my money and I want the money back from the lekeach. Then you cancel that and the lekeach has to take back the field. What's the keach of the husband over here? So the Smeh says, simply, he's a lekeach. By him being in Nichsim Milug, he's a lekeach. He's considered a lekeach in Nichsim Milug. And therefore, the wife cannot be meichel his rights without his approval. She has no money. That's the whole discussion. There's no money. The original halacha, everything was these kinds, unless she has a specific arrangement, her money is her money. Now, what happens the second story where we said that the lekeach threw out, that the woman was mesalik the lekeach, then the husband changed his mind. The shach over here brings the bach and says, very important to point out, that we're talking about the lekeach left by his own free will and accord. He wasn't forced. It's not that the wife was mesalik the lekeach. The wife went to the lekeach, and the lekeach said, okay, I'm mesalik from the story. Why? The Bach says the lekeach has a right to say, I'm not leaving yet. I want to wait for your husband to come back. You're going to throw me out. We're going to go through this whole transaction. Next week your husband is coming back to town. For all practical purposes, he's going to come and say, I wasn't interested in what you did. Let's redo it again. Ends up being, I'm doing 3 transactions on the same field. I bought it from the moicher, sold it to you, and now you sell it back to me. Why should I go through the whole headache? Wait till the husband comes back, Hatzach and Derama, we'll deal with it then. And he has a right to say such a thing. And the Nesivis brings the shach and says, so obviously, if the lekeach says, it doesn't make a difference to me to wait, I'm not planning on waiting until your husband comes back, then obviously you could get rid of the wife could get rid of him right away. Comes in the Sivis and says, but it's a problem. It becomes a hezek to the moicher, because if the lekeach knows that he has to wait until the husband comes, so then what's going to happen? The lekeach is going to say, why should I buy it? I'm taking a risk, a big risk. If the karka goes down in value and I paid $1 million for it, then by the time the husband comes back, it's going to be worth $900,000. The husband is going to say, Gesundheit, keep it. I'm not paying for you $1 million for $900,000 field. And if the property is going to go up to 1.2, the husband is going to come and is going to say, oh, it's very nice. I could pay $1 million for 1.2 property. So I'm going to get stuck whichever way I do it. So therefore, he's not even want to buy it. If he's not going to want to buy it, the moicher is going to be, there's a ra to the moicher, there's a loss. There's a loss to the moicher. And if there's a loss to the moicher, there's no din of the bar metzra. So therefore, he's talking about over here, who bought the field, who's the lekeach? Relatives of the husband, relatives of the wife, whatever, family. And therefore, they know that whether the husband is going to make a decision that he wants to keep it or he doesn't want to keep it, he's not going to have an issue with the fact that his brothers bought it. And the same thing, the brothers are not going to have an issue with living next. They're going to buy it anyways. They want to live next to their brother. But if it's a woman that doesn't have money of her own, so then there's no way for you to throw out the lekeach when the husband comes back if she's the one who paid for it. Why? Because over there the moicher could say, true, over there it's a ra to the moicher, because the lekeach is going to say, if I'm going to have to wait till this woman's husband is going to come back, I'm going to be stuck, and I don't know if it's worth it for me to remain with this or not. So it seems like for the Nesivis, a point that the Nesivis disagrees with the Shulchan Aruch on a certain nekuda. And he holds that be'etzem, a wife can never be mesalik lekeach. Why? Because she has none of her own money. And her siluk is a siluk al tzad safek. You can't be mesalik a lekeach al safek, because maybe the husband is going to come back and he's not going to be mesalik. And misafek, you can't be mesalik. And the Aruch HaShulchan, that's how the Aruch HaShulchan Taki understood the Nesivis. And that's what the Aruch HaShulchan adds, that the only way a woman could be mesalik a lekeach that bought the property on her meitzar is if she taka has her own money, halachically it's her own money. And therefore, she could be mesalik. But otherwise, it's a siluk misafik.
Or if it's craving without the
Or if it's craving, yeah. Shoshanas Yaakov over here also points out a very important thing, going back to the beginning of the Seif. Nichse milug. Nichse milug is if the nichse milug generate peiros. You have a field which is a fruit-bearing field. But a karka which has no fruits, even though there is a discussion that the husband could come and have in nichse milug, the husband could have a claim to the gufa karka in certain scenarios. Why? Because the husband could say, I could sell this karka and buy a different karka that brings peiros. He has some rights to the gufa karka. He could say, why am I holding onto this barren field that you own? It's worth $2 million. I'll sell it for $2 million. I'll buy a $2 million property somewhere else, which does grow fruits. So he does have some rights to the nichse milug. So he says, the Shana Sakar says, no, that's not enough to create bar metzra. If the field is not moitzi peiros and it's a nichse milug, the husband has no right to say anything about that field, to undo, to do, to force. He's out of the picture.
You usually the field doesn't have fruit. You always think to do with the field.
Right, so he says, no, do the bar metzra.
No, I'm saying, how does it call five?
The husband can't come and undo it, he says. The husband can't come and undo it and say, I'm not happy that my wife bought the field next door. And he says, and why is there no dinner de bar metzra? He says, very simple. What's the most the husband can do with nichse milug that don't generate fruits? Sell it and buy something which generates fruits. The moment he sells this field that doesn't generate fruits, he's ois matzim to the field which was just sold. So why go through the circle? There's no dinner de bar metzra to begin with. And then he asks a question, and with that we're going to conclude, because he also concludes with yesh liyashev and doesn't give you an answer. And he says that l'chayra, I have a question b'chlal on this whole thing. The Baal is not a real matzrin. The Baal is a temporary matzrin. Just like the Taz explains in the din of Seicher, why is a Seicher not a matzrin? Because the matzrin arai, even if it's a lifetime schirus. Because there's no lo'ilam over here. There's no Yerusha, doesn't continue weiter. So the husband is also a matzrin arai. Why is the husband a matzrin arai? Because the fact that he's now a lekeach and a nichse milug is only so long as he remains married to his wife. And he outlives her. And then he gets the field. And then his kids are going to get the field. But if he goes to heavens before she does, his kids are not going to get anything. So he's a Matzah Na'arai. So therefore, how could a Matzah Na'arai be take from the lake, be Mesalik Lekeach, which did a Kinyan Eilam? There's no Bar Metzra. And he says, V'yesh Yashiv, and doesn't give you an answer. So if you guys figure it out, get back to me. With that we conclude.